I'd like to spend a little time talking about a concept called depth of field. Now, depth of field is something that we've mentioned in class repeatedly at this point, but let's really focus on it for a minute. And there's a pun built in there, which maybe you caught. But let's just imagine I'm going to take a photograph of venom sitting on a tank, right? So I've got my camera here, I've got it focused on venom, and venom is 1 foot away from the lens, so my camera is focused at 1 foot. So venom will be in focus. But the question is, will Spider-Man, who's a little bit farther away than venom, also be in focus? And will Buzz Lightyear, who's a little bit closer to us than venom, also be in focus? This is depth of field, right? If I'm shooting with a very shallow depth of field, only venom will be in focus. As my depth of field gets wider and wider, more things come into focus besides what I focused on, right? I'm focused at 1 foot. Anything that's 1 foot away would be in focus, right? If I put my reading glasses here at 1 foot away, they'll be in focus. But the question is, what about things that are closer than 1 foot? What about things that are farther away than 1 foot? Let's take a look at a couple of images here. If you look at these two images, what's the difference between the one on the left and the one on the right? The one on the right, the only thing that's in focus is our talent, our model. She's in focus. The background is incredibly soft. We can't tell much about the background other than it's green. On the left, the background has more detail to it. We can tell that it's individual leaves. They're not sharp, but the difference between these two is the depth of field. Let's look at another one. This is exactly the same concept. In the image on the left, our model is sharp and nothing else is. The background is soft, the tree is soft. She is the only thing that's sharp. The image on the right, she's sharp, the tree is sharp, and even the foliage in the background, the individual fronds of grass back there are sharp. So the one on the left has a very shallow or a very narrow depth of field. The one on the right has a very deep or a very great depth of field. There's 3 ways that we can control depth of field, and now you're going to see why we've been doing some of the exercises we've been doing. Probably the easiest way is with zoom, so we're going to start with that. I have an image here. I set 4 Buzz Lightyears on a table. I set the camera in front of the table, and then I zoomed all the way in and I focused on one Buzz Lightyear and I took this picture. And as you can see, we can see that the close Buzz Lightyear, the one I focused on, is sharp. The Buzz Lightyear hiding over his shoulder is very soft. We can hardly tell what it is. If I zoom out, I'm not changing anything else. I'm not moving the camera closer or farther away. I'm not moving my talent. I'm not changing my exposure. All I'm doing is zooming out. We come up with this shot. And now you can see all 4 Buzz Lightyears there. But notice that the one in the back is now in focus, or very nearly in focus. He might be just a little bit soft. But the one in the front is in focus, the 2 in the middle are in focus, and then the one in the back is pretty much in focus. So my depth of field increased as I zoomed out. Here's what that looks like graphically. If you imagine you were overhead and you drew a picture of it, right? When I zoomed all the way in, my depth of field was very narrow. It was about enough for one Buzz Lightyear and nothing else. Anything that was closer or farther away was going to be soft. But notice that as I zoom out, again, I didn't change anything else. All I did was zoom out. My depth of field gets greater. So not only do I see all 4 Buzz Lightyears because I'm zooming out, but all 4 of them become in focus. We can do the same thing by changing the distance between the camera and the subject. So here's that same setup. And I've taken the photograph where the camera is very close to the table. And again, I can only see the 2 Buzz Lightyears. The other 2 are still there. They're out of the frame at the moment. But again, notice the Buzz Lightyear in the foreground is in focus. The Buzz Lightyear in the background is not in focus. Now, this time I'm going to move the camera farther away. I'm not going to touch the zoom. I'm not touching the exposure. Literally, the only thing I'm doing is taking the tripod and pulling it farther from the table. And this is what I get. And again, notice that the Buzz Lightyear in the foreground is still in focus, but the Buzz Lightyear in the background is also in focus now. And of course, the 2 on the sides that we can see are sharp because they're in between there. So again, if we look at this graphically, When I was close to the table, my depth of field was very narrow. It was enough for one Buzz Lightyear and really no more. As I moved the camera farther away from the table, not only did my field of view open up so I could see more Buzz Lightyears, but my depth of field got greater. The front Buzz and the back Buzz were in focus and everything in between. So working with your zoom or working with your distance accomplishes about the same thing. The farther you are from the talent, the more depth of field you have. The closer you are to the talent, the less depth of field you have. The more you zoom out, the more depth of field you have. The more you zoom in, the less depth of field you have. Okay, that's easy enough. But there's a third way that we can do this, and it's by playing with the aperture. And this is why we've spent so much time working on exposure. This is why it's important to me that you can get a good exposure and then change it. You can decide to use a different aperture. You can decide to use a different shutter speed because you can control your depth of field by controlling your aperture, right? This is great. Take a look at this. So in this series of pictures, what the photographer has done is they have changed their exposure. They have not moved closer or farther to the talent. They have not zoomed in or out. It's just a series of 5 pictures of this girl standing in a stream fishing. The one on the left was shot with f1.4, and it has a very shallow depth of field. The girl is in focus, and that's it. Nothing in the foreground, nothing in the background is in focus. And then look, as we march across there, as we start closing that iris down to f2.8, to f5.6, to f11, to f16, the more we close the iris down, the more the depth of field grows. So by the time you get to f16, almost everything in that shot is in focus. The girl, of course, remains in focus. The bubbles in the stream that are closer to us are in focus. The water behind her is in focus. The grass in the background, you can see the individual leaves and fronds in it. So the only thing that's changed between that left-hand image and that right-hand image is the exposure that the photographer used. Now, of course, as the photographer is closing the iris down, that person is having to adjust the camera in other ways, right? Changing the shutter speed or changing the ISO to keep the exposure constant. But by changing the aperture, you're also changing the depth of field. Okay. This is one that I shot out in front of Ivanhall. This is the Father Chaminade statue with the Sullivan Family Library in the background. And you can see Father Chaminade is in focus, but the sign behind him is not in focus. I shot this with an exposure of f4, with an aperture of f4. In this next image, I have closed down to an aperture of f16. And look what's happened. Both Father Chaminade and the sign behind him are in focus. And the palm fronds are in focus. Let's go back to the first image. So when I was shooting at f4, Father Chaminade was sharp. The palm tree, which is halfway in between the two, is soft. And of course, the sign is soft. When I changed to f16, everything in that picture is in focus. Father Chaminade is sharp, the palm fronds are sharp, and the Sullivan Family Library sign is sharp. So here's what it looked like the first time. When I shot at f4, I was about 16 feet away from the Father Chaminade statue, about 40 feet away from the wall. That doesn't change. But notice that my depth of field there, it's about as wide as the statue is. The statue is in focus, but nothing really closer or farther. But when I change that exposure to use f16 instead, look at how wide my depth of field got. It goes all the way back to 40 feet, maybe even a little bit further. It even comes a little bit closer than Father Chaminade was. All I changed, I didn't move closer or farther, I didn't zoom in or out. All I changed was that f-stop. So here's the same idea. Here's a series of 4 Buzz Lightyears. Now these are stacked on a table at 1-foot intervals, and I have very carefully focused on Buzz Lightyear number 2. Using an f-stop of 2.8, he's the only Buzz Lightyear in focus, right? So if I want to call attention to something that's in the middle of a line of similar items, I can use depth of field to control that. Now here's that same shot at f11. Again, I've closed down several stops, and by closing down, I've increased my depth of field. And look, the close Buzz Lightyear is in focus, or very nearly in focus. Buzz Lightyear number 2 is sharp. Buzz Lightyear number 3 is sharp. Buzz Lightyear number 4 is sharp, or very nearly sharp. I probably should have pushed that all the way to f16. But anyway, you can see, let's look at that again. At f2.8, there's only one Buzz Lightyear that's clearly in focus, and that's Buzz Lightyear number 2. The other three are very clearly out of focus. The same zoom, the same distance, just changing my iris, just changing the exposure to f11, all of the Buzz Lightyears are in focus, or very nearly so. So looking at this graphically, right, so the Buzz Lightyears were at 1 foot intervals, so the closest one was at 9 feet from the camera, the farthest was 12 feet from the camera. When I focused on Buzz Lightyear number 2, literally the depth of field was enough to cover one Buzz Lightyear, and not much more. By the time I close down to f11, that depth of field has gotten broad enough that I can get all 4 Buzz Lightyears inside of it. Okay, depth of field is a powerful storytelling technique. It allows you to tell the audience what to look at and what is not important, right? So again, the photograph that has the background and the foreground soft and just the subject is sharp, it tells us the subject is what's important. The photograph in which everything in a range of distances is sharp tells us these are all important things. So take a look at this chart. This will help you to remember, I hope, how to control your depth of field. So if you're talking about zooming in or out, as you zoom in, as you get more magnification, as you go more telephoto, you lose depth of field. As you zoom out, as your field of view gets wider, you get more depth of field. If you're talking about distance to and from your subject, the closer you get to your subject, the less depth of field you're going to have. The farther away you are from your subject, the more depth of field you're going to have. And those are relatively easy to manipulate if you've got the freedom to do so, right? If you can get closer to or farther from your subject, if you're in a situation where that's possible. If zooming in or out doesn't ruin your composition and your very carefully chosen framing. But doing it with your aperture, you can manipulate depth of field independent of the framing, right? If you have the perfect image, it's framed exactly the way you want to. You need to control the depth of field, though. The aperture is the way to go. The more open your aperture is, the lower the f number, the less depth of field you will have. The tinier that aperture gets, the higher the f number, the more depth of field you will have. Okay, now that you know how to control your depth of field, there's one more detail to keep in mind. Your depth of field is not symmetrical. It does not extend equally in front of and behind your point of focus. Most of it's behind. So, right, if we have our camera and we are set up, we are focused on Venom sitting here on the tank and whatever distance that is. Now, if Spider-Man is in focus and he's a little bit closer, right? So my depth of field in front of Venom is that far, which means that I should be able to go twice that far behind Venom and have Buzz Lightyear in focus. So 1/3 of my depth of field is in front of my point of focus. 2/3 of my depth of field extends behind my point of focus. Okay. So if you look at the image here, you can see I've tried to draw that out. So let's go back to our earlier images. So in this picture, when I had the shallow depth of field shooting at f4 of Father Chaminade, I actually was focused on Father Chaminade's face, probably on his left cheekbone or his left eye. Because I knew that my depth of field would be shallow and I wanted it to extend, enough to cover the statue itself. When I changed my exposure to f16 so that I'd get more depth of field, I also took advantage of this knowledge and I changed my focus point a little bit. I pushed it farther away. So if you look at this diagram, you can see that my point of focus was actually a little bit farther away than Father Chaminade himself. But because my depth of field extended in both directions, it meant that the focus covered Father Chaminade, who was closer than my point of focus, and it also included the wall of the library, which was farther than my point of focus. So when you're playing with large distances like this, and you're trying to get a lot of depth of field, it's totally okay to shift your focus to something a little bit farther away than what you thought your subject was. It's kind of just a numbers game. But anyway, work with this, play with this. Being able to control your depth of field is one of the things, one of the most powerful things that you can do to tell stories with your images. And it's one of the things that really separates the people who want to be photographers from the people who are photographers. Knowing how to do this, knowing how to control your tools to manipulate the depth of field is a really powerful tool to have in your arsenal.